They told me my engagement dinner looked like something off a clearance rack, then spent the rest of the night toasting my younger sister's real engagement at the country club like I wasn't sitting at the same table. What none of them bothered to find out at was that the quiet man holding my hand under the tablecloth owned half the skyline they liked to brag about driving past. What they really didn't know was that their golden favorite's fiancé was about to be led off a golf course in handcuffs while I walked into my wedding in a dress that cost more than my father's house. When my mother finally figured out the truth and called me sobbing, begging to be let back in, I only sent her 4 words. Not this time, Mom. I'm Natalie, 28 years old, and for most of my life I thought love in my family was something you had to earn by staying small. I grew up outside Charlotte, North Carolina, in a neighborhood where every lawn was edged like a military inspection, and every mother compared report cards over coffee they didn't actually drink. My parents, Carol and Russell, cared more about what the neighbors thought than what was happening behind our own front door. I was the responsible one, the one who paid her own way through community college and then a state university, working at a dental office answering phones while I finished my degree in accounting. My sister Devon was 2 years younger and built entirely different. She didn't have to try, because trying was beneath her. She floated through life assuming someone would always catch her, and in my family, someone always did. That dynamic didn't fade when we got older. If anything, it calcified. By the time I was 28, the pattern between us was so worn in that nobody even questioned it anymore. Devon got the bigger room growing up because she needed space to be creative. Devon got the car when she turned 16 because mine could wait a year. Devon got to skip family obligations because she was going through something, while I was expected to show up smiling no matter what I was going through myself. I used to tell myself it didn't bother me. That was a lie I got very good at telling. The night everything cracked open was supposed to be my engagement dinner. I'd been with Theo for 14 months by then, and I'd asked my parents gently, almost apologetically, if we could do a small dinner at their house to celebrate. My mother agreed the way she agreed to things she didn't actually want to do, with a sigh dressed up as enthusiasm. I spent 2 days cooking. I made a roast chicken with the lemon and rosemary stuffed under the skin the way my grandmother used to do it, and a salad with the good cheese, and I bought a tablecloth because ours at home had a coffee stain shaped like Florida. I wanted, for one night, for my family to look at me and see something worth celebrating. Theo showed up in a plain navy sweater and jeans, holding a bottle of wine he'd picked because he liked the label, not because of the price, which I would later learn was the opposite of cheap. He was quiet in groups, the kind of quiet that made people assume there wasn't much going on underneath. He worked in renewable energy investment, which is what he always said when people asked, and which made my father's eyes glaze over almost instantly. My father liked things he can met against a number he already understood. Theo, in his sweater with his soft voice and his refusal to talk over anyone, didn't register as impressive to a man who measured worth in golf club memberships and watch brands. Halfway through dinner, my mother set down her fork and announced, in the bright, brittle voice she used when she wanted an entire room to listen, that Devon had news of her own. Devon's boyfriend, Bradley, had proposed that very afternoon on the 18th hole of their country club in front of the whole golf league, with a ring that, and my mother actually used these words, you could see from space. The table erupted. My father stood up to shake Bradley's hand even though Bradley wasn't there. My mother cried real tears, the kind she had never once produced for me, and then, without any pause, without so much as glancing at the ring on my own finger, my mother turned to me and said, well, isn't it funny how things work out? Some of us just have more natural taste than others. I felt the air leave the room. Theo's hand found mine under the table and held it steady, the way you'd hold something that was shaking, even if it wasn't visible to anyone else. My father chuckled and added that he'd always said Devon had champagne taste, like it was a compliment instead of a knife. Nobody asked Theo a single question that night. Nobody asked what he did, where he was from, how we met. They had already decided, the way they always decided everything about me, that whatever I had built for myself was the consolation prize. We left early. In the car, Theo didn't say much, just reached over and squeezed my knee at a red light. You don't have to keep doing this to yourself, he said quietly. I told him I knew. I didn't know. Not really. Not yet. I had spent 28 years believing that if I just worked a little harder, smiled a little wider, achieved a little more, eventually they would look at me the way they looked at Devon. That night was the first time I let myself admit that no amount of effort was ever going to be enough because the problem was never me. The problem was a story they needed to tell about themselves, and I had been cast as the supporting character since birth. 3 weeks later, Devon called me, breathless and excited, to tell me her engagement party was happening at the Cedarbrook Country Club, the fanciest club in our part of the state, and that Bradley was going all out. She didn't invite me directly. She told me to check the group chat for details, like I was a distant cousin instead of her only sister. When I opened the group chat, I saw the date. It was the same weekend Theo and I had already chosen months earlier for our own wedding, a small ceremony at a botanical garden 2 hours away that we'd booked, because the gardens reminded Theo of his grandmother's backyard in Vermont. My mother had known about our date for months. She had RSVP'd to it herself. When I called her, confused, asking if she remembered, my mother's tone went flat in a way I recognized instantly, the tone she used right before she said something designed to hurt. "Natalie, honestly, we can't be in two places at once, and Devon's party is going to be the event of the season. People are flying in. You'll understand when you see the guest list." I asked her, point blank, if she was telling me my own parents weren't coming to my wedding. There was a long pause, and then she said the words I will never forget as long as I live. "It's not that we don't want to come, sweetheart. It's just that your wedding is so modest. We didn't think it would matter much either way." Modest. That was the word she used for the day I had dreamed about since I was a little girl pressing flowers between the pages of library books. I didn't cry on the phone. I'd learned a long time ago never to give her that. I said, "Okay," and I hung up, and I sat on the edge of my bed in the apartment Theo and I shared, staring at the wall, feeling something inside me shift permanently, like a bone setting wrong and then setting again, straighter this time. I told Theo that night. He listened without interrupting, which was one of the things I loved most about him, the way he let silence do some of the talking. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he asked me something I wasn't expecting. "Do you actually want them there? Or do you want the version of them that doesn't exist?" I didn't have an answer right away. But sitting with the question, I realized the truth. I didn't want my mother there. I wanted a mother who would have wanted to be there. Those were two very different people, and only one of them was real. What my family didn't know, what almost no one knew, was what Theo actually did for a living. He wasn't just in renewable energy investment. He was the founder and majority owner of a company that had quietly built and financed solar and wind infrastructure across 9 states, a company that had just closed a deal worth more than my entire hometown's annual tax revenue. He kept it private, almost obsessively so, because he'd grown up the son of a contractor in rural Vermont and he'd watched money change every single person he'd ever seen come into it suddenly. He didn't want to be loved for what he had. He wanted, just once in his life, to be loved for who he was first. With me, he got that, because I fell for the man in the second-hand truck before I ever found out what was parked in his actual garage. I hadn't told my family either, not out of strategy, but because it had genuinely never come up. They'd never asked enough questions about Theo to learn anything real about him. They were too busy being unimpressed. The weeks leading up to the dueling events were strange. Devon's engagement party ballooned into something enormous. Ice sculptures, a live band, a guest list that apparently included half the local Chamber of Commerce, all funded by Bradley, who worked in private wealth management and who my father praised constantly for his vision. I quietly continued planning my small wedding at the botanical garden, just 30 guests, string lights, the kind of wedding that didn't need anyone's permission to be beautiful. About 10 days before everything came to a head, I ran into Bradley at a coffee shop near my office. I almost didn't recognize him out of his usual blazer and loafers uniform. He was animated, talking loudly into his phone about rolling over the Hendricks account before the quarter closes. Words that meant nothing to me at the time but would mean everything 2 weeks later. When he spotted me, his whole demeanor changed, sliding into the practiced charm he used around family. He sat down uninvited, ordered an espresso he didn't pay for, and spent 10 minutes telling me, unprompted, how he felt sorry for me planning such a small wedding, how he hoped Theo at least had decent prospects, how money problems were the #1 thing that ruined marriages and he'd hate to see that happen to me. I let him talk. I'd learned that with men like Bradley, the fastest way to learn what they were hiding was to let their own confidence do the digging for you. He bragged about a new investment opportunity he was rolling several of the club members into, something with returns that sounded too clean, too round, too good. He mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that he'd needed to move some funds around quickly to cover the deposit on the country club venue because the engagement party costs had gotten a little ahead of him. I filed all of it away and said nothing, just nodded along and let him feel important. When he finally stood to leave, he patted my shoulder like I was a child and said, "Don't worry, Nat. Once Devin and I are married, we'll make sure you're still included in things." Included, as if I were a charity case he was generously planning to keep around. I told Theo about the conversation that night, mostly as a funny, infuriating anecdote. But Theo got quiet in a different way, the focused way he got when something didn't sit right with him professionally. He asked me to repeat exactly what Bradley had said about moving funds around and rolling over accounts. When I did, he picked up his phone and made a call I wasn't part of. He didn't tell me what it was about. He just said gently, "Let me look into something. I'll explain when I know more." 3 days later, he sat me down at our kitchen table with his laptop open and walked me through it carefully, like he was breaking bad news to a client instead of telling his fiancé a secret about her future brother-in-law. Bradley wasn't in private wealth management in any traditional sense. He was running what amounted to an unregistered investment scheme, pulling money from members of the country club crowd. People who trusted him because he golfed with their husbands and tipped well at the bar, promising guaranteed returns that didn't exist, using new investor money to pay off the earlier ones. A classic structure, Theo said, the kind that always collapses. The only question is when. Theo, because of his own legitimate investment background, had contacts who'd already flagged irregularities in Bradley's filings months earlier. The SEC had been quietly building a case, it just hadn't gone public yet. I sat there absorbing it, feeling something complicated, not triumphant exactly, more like watching weather roll in that you know is going to change everything, but you don't yet know how. "What do we do?" I asked. Theo took my hand. "Nothing," he said. "We do nothing. The people whose job this is will do their job on their own timeline. We are not going to play detective, and we are not going to warn anyone. We're going to go to our wedding and have the best day of our lives, and whatever happens to Bradley happens because of choices Bradley made, not because of anything we did." I appreciated, more than I could say, that Theo wasn't interested in revenge. He just wanted me to be free of needing it. The day arrived. Devin's engagement party and my wedding fell on the same Saturday, 2 hours apart, like two trains running on parallel tracks toward two very different destinations. I spent the morning getting ready in a small sunlit room at the botanical garden with my best friend Josie zipping up the back of a dress I'd picked, because it made me feel like myself, not because it needed to impress anyone. There were no ice sculptures. There was a string quartet made up of 2 music students and a cellist Theo's mother knew from church. There were exactly 31 guests, including a few of Theo's relatives, who drove down from Vermont and treated me, instantly and without conditions, like family. My parents weren't there. Neither was Devin. I felt the absence, I won't pretend I didn't, a small hollow space where they should have been standing. But I also felt, for the first time at any major moment in my life, completely unwatched by people waiting to find fault. Theo cried when he saw me walk down the aisle between the rows of white peonies, openly, without embarrassment, which somehow undid me more than any vow either of us said later. We were married by 4 in the afternoon under a wooden arch his father had built by hand and shipped down from Vermont in pieces. 2 hours away, at Cedarbrook Country Club, the band was setting up, the ice sculptures were melting slowly in the late afternoon heat, and Bradley was, according to what I pieced together later from Devon and from local news, in the middle of toasting his own engagement when 3 unmarked sedans pulled into the club's circular drive. Federal agents from the SEC's Enforcement Division, along with local financial crimes investigators, walked directly through the club's grand entrance and asked the staff to point them toward Bradley. He apparently tried to slip out through the kitchen. He didn't make it past the parking lot. Devin, standing at the center of the dance floor in a dress that cost more than my entire wedding, watched her fiancé get walked out in handcuffs in front of 200 guests, including the very members of the country club crowd he'd been quietly defrauding for the better part of a year. My mother told me later, in a voice still shaking with disbelief, that several of the guests had immediately pulled out their phones, not to film sympathetically, but to call their own lawyers, because they suddenly understood exactly what had happened to their retirement contributions. My phone started buzzing around 6 that evening, just as Theo and I were cutting our small, simple lemon cake under the string lights. I let it buzz. I was busy being looked at by a man who'd never once made me feel like a consolation prize. By the time we finally checked our phones that night, back at the little inn where we were staying before our flight to Vermont the next morning, there were 11 missed calls from my mother and a string of texts that started panicked and ended pleading. The first few were almost accusatory, demanding to know if I'd known, if Theo had known, if we'd somehow caused this. By the fourth or fifth text, the tone shifted entirely. My mother had clearly done some quiet research of her own in the chaos of the afternoon, the kind of research she should have done 14 months earlier, and found out exactly who Theo's family actually was, what his company was actually worth, what kind of life her modest daughter had actually built. The last text, sent at almost 10 that night, read, "Natalie, please call me. We had no idea about Theo. We're your family. We can fix this if you just talk to us." I looked at that message for a long time, sitting on the edge of the hotel bed in my travel clothes, Theo's hand resting warm on my back. I thought about the dinner table where they'd celebrated Devon's engagement and let mine pass without a single question. I thought about the word modest, the way my mother had said it like a diagnosis. I thought about 28 years of being the background character in a story that was never actually about me. I typed 4 words back. "Not this time, Mom." Then I did something I had never once let myself do in my entire life. I went into my phone's settings, one by one, and blocked my mother, my father, and my sister. Not out of rage, though there was plenty of that underneath, but out of something calmer and more permanent. I wasn't punishing them. I was simply, finally, choosing not to keep a door open for people who had never once walked through it for me. The calls and the messages stopped, at least to me, though I heard secondhand for weeks afterward about the fallout. Bradley's case made the local news for almost a month. The investment scheme had pulled in nearly $4 million from close to 60 different investors, many of them friends of my parents from the club. Devon's engagement, unsurprisingly, did not survive the scandal. My mother, I'm told, spent a long time trying to distance herself publicly from the whole situation, telling anyone who would listen that she'd always had a bad feeling about Bradley, conveniently forgetting the toast she'd given in his honor at my own engagement dinner. Theo and I settled into our life quietly, the way we both preferred it. He kept building his company. I kept my job at the accounting firm for almost a year after the wedding, not because we needed the money, but because I needed, for a while, to know I could stand on my own ground, even with someone who could have swept it out from under me without trying. Eventually, I left to start something of my own, a small nonprofit that helps first-generation college students navigate financial aid, the kind of resource I desperately could have used at 19, answering phones at a dental office and wondering if I'd ever be enough for anyone. It's been almost 2 years now. My mother has reached out twice through other relatives, careful, testing messages relayed through an aunt I'm still close with, asking if I might be willing to let bygones be bygones. I haven't responded either time, and I don't feel guilty about that anymore, which surprised me the first time I noticed it. For years I thought forgiveness was something you owed people simply because they shared your blood. I don't believe that anymore. I believe you owe real effort to people who show up for you, and you owe nothing at all to people who only show up once they realize what they almost lost. Some nights, usually when it's quiet and Theo's already asleep beside me, I think about that dinner table, my mother's bright voice announcing Devon's news, the word modest hanging in the air like smoke. I used to think that moment broke something in me. I understand it differently now. It didn't break me. It finally let me see clearly, for the first time in my life, exactly what I'd been trying so hard to fit into for 28 years, and exactly why it had never once fit. I stopped trying to shrink myself down to a size my family found comfortable, and in the space that opened up, I grew into a life nobody handed me and nobody can take away. My family wanted a quiet, modest daughter who knew her place. What they got instead was a woman who finally understood she never needed their permission to be extraordinary.